Hi there folks, in today's demonstration I'm going to walk you through the 7 different data operations in Power Automate Cloud Flows. So this is going to be some examples, how to use them, some tips and tricks, ultimately very useful if you're new or even indeed if you're experienced in Power Automate. So without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. So for the first action I'm going to add in a compose. Now a compose is a read-only variable. Very useful for evaluating expressions. And what do I mean by evaluating expressions? Well, if I go into the input here, I can go into FX, I can go and add in an expression like UTC now, and in that I can insert the format of the date that I'd like to output. So we can see I have the year, month, day. Now, if I add that, I now have an expression in there, and when it next runs, it will give me the current date. But of course, if I want to use the date throughout my flow for naming files, etc., rather than having to call that action each time, I can just use the output from compose. And in fact, I could call this compose date. And then next time, when I add in another action, like in this case, another compose, when I come into the inputs and choose the dynamic content using this lightning bolt, we can see that from the compose date, I can use the output. And that will, of course, give me the date that is saved in the compose date action. Now, the other feature, which is quite useful, is you can store data in a compose. That could be a string, for instance, the content of an email if you're sending emails out to people. Or in my case, because I want to demonstrate lots of different use cases with all these data operations and I need some data, if I jump across into Copilot, here is some data that I prepared earlier. I asked Copilot to create me an array of data. And if you're new to arrays in JSON, then of course I've got a video on that and I'll have that in the description for you to watch. But if I copy this data, I can come across into the input, I can paste that in, and I now have an array of data in my compose. And for good naming convention, I'll call this my compose array. So now anywhere that I reference my output from the compose array, I can access this array of data. So those are some examples of using a compose. What about our next action? So if I click on the plus, add another action, let's have a look for Parse JSON. Now Parse JSON is an action that will take the output of an array, and that can be from an API or in my case, my compose action. So if I use the outputs from the compose array, you could also use the output from a variable if that is an array data type. But the first thing we need to do here is to generate a schema, which we can do from our sample payload, i.e. the array of data. Now before I do that, if I right click on my compose array, I'm going to pin the action and we can see the data on the left hand side. If I then go to use a sample payload, I can paste in our payload, hit done, and a schema has now been generated. Now, because I've got this compose array pinned on the left-hand side, we can kind of understand what's happened in the Parse JSON by generating that schema. It's correctly identified the type of data that I provided, which is an array of data. It's also defined an object structure, which are each of these in the squiggly brackets. And it's also identified all the properties or the keys like common name or scientific name, which match again with the left-hand side, as well as the different data types being strings. And of course, if there are integers, then it would be int. And there are other data types too. The other thing to note is within the required properties of the schema, you've got all 5 of my keys or properties. If you did have a data source where that varies, some are required, some are not, this is the default schema that you've generated. You can, of course, modify it. And so if the habitat was optional, you could remove that from the schema. But with the Parse JSON now built, what that ultimately allows you to do is if I add in an action, and again, you'll note me using a compose lots here for the demonstration. If I come into that compose, I come into the dynamic content. If I look at the data that's available for my Parse JSON, it has all of the different names as a result of me defining them in the schema. If we look at the output of the compose array and the output of compose date, we only have the outputs, which is either the full date from the expression or the full array from the compose array. So by using Parse JSON, we've enabled Power Automate to ultimately create dynamic content from the original data source, which was our compose array. And we'll see more use of that later on. Now I'm going to remove this compose to, and I'll move on to the next action. So the next action that I want to look for is the filter array. If I choose that action, the filter array is looking for an array to filter. And if we go into the dynamic content, you'll see that it either lets me use the body from Parse JSON, or the outputs from the date, which I know is a date string, or the outputs from the array, which I know is an array. But if I use the outputs from the array and then I want to go and filter on the data, and we have a look at the dynamic content that's available, because I've used the outputs from the array, I don't have access to the column that I want to filter, which is the size. If I was to choose the size here, let's have a watch and see what happens. It puts me into an apply to each. Now the reason it's done that is because the filter array has been attached to the outputs of the compose array, yet I'm trying to use a value from the Parse JSON. So in order to correct this, if I delete this apply to each, I'll re-add that filter array. In the from, I'll insert the body of Parse JSON, and then in the filter, when I choose a dynamic content for the size, we're not put into an apply to each because we've kept the relationship here between the size, which is part of the Parse JSON, and of course the Parse JSON will use the output from the compose array, so we know we're using that original array. Now in the body size, I want to check the size. And again, if I right click on that compose array and pin the action, we can see that we've got medium as one of those options, we've got small, and there are also some large. So I'd like to go and filter based on those that are equal to large. The thing to note is string comparison is case sensitive. So I'm going to have to make sure that I have an uppercase L in my filter. But we now have a condition with our filter array that will take the data from the Parse JSON, check the body size is equal to large, and it will output a new array that just has those cats that have a large size. So the next data operation I'd like to demonstrate is the create CSV table. And for those that have got legacy systems, you might need to create a CSV file. And this is what the CSV table action will do. It will take an array of data like our compose array on the left-hand side here, and it will turn it into a CSV. So using dynamic content, I'm going to choose the outputs of the compose array, and whilst we can go and change the advanced parameters, pick the columns here, you'll note that you can either automatically use those columns that are already in that array, which is the 5 different columns, or if you want to be very specific, you can use custom. I'm not going to change it at this point. We'll see an equivalent of how to do this later on in the video. So we'll keep things at automatic, and this of course will create a CSV based on all the data from the original array. Now of course, if I just wanted a CSV based on the filter array, rather than using the outputs from the compose array, of course I can replace this using a dynamic content from the body of the filter array, and that will be a CSV file that just contains those 6 records based on the filter. Now the next action I'd like to use is a select, and the select is probably my most favorite action, but it allows you to reshape or transform the original data structure. So I've still got that compose array on the left hand side. The select is very much based on an array, so we can use the Parse JSON, we can use the outputs of compose array, we could use the filter array. I'm going to use the Parse JSON because I'm going to take the data from that original array, and then I'm going to create a new mapping. So very much like the manual mode of the create CSV action. So here we can specify the keys and the values, the key being the column name. And in this case, what I'd like to do is, rather than have these 5 columns, I'm going to create my own structure that just has 2 columns. And those 2 columns will be used in my HTML table later on. So I would like to have, rather than common name, to have name. And if I go into dynamic content, I should be able to go down to Parse JSON and choose common name as the dynamic content. When it comes to the other field I'd like to have, I would like to have the animal size, we'll call it, rather than size. And again, if I use dynamic content, I can scroll down to the Parse JSON and I can use the size. Now what this has done is created us a new array based on the structure that we've defined. The keys are going to be based on name and animal size, and the values are going to be based on the common name and the original size key within the array that we currently see open on the left-hand side. This is exactly the same when it comes to creating a CSV or creating an HTML table. If you toggle between that automatic and manual, you can define your own key and value. Now you're probably thinking, what if I wanted to use the data from the filter array? Well, if you attempt to do that direct, you'll probably find yourselves in an apply to each. So my recommendation would be to use the original data source, which is the data from the Parse JSON, to create this new structure. And then what you can actually do is you can remove the original input, which was the body, and you can replace it with the body of the filter array. So under the bonnet, these expressions which are written are universal. They're based on item, open close bracket, that you can see on screen here, and then in square brackets and single quotes, the name of the key. The only difference with using Parse JSON and writing your own expressions is that you can add in a question mark between the opening close brackets and square brackets, which means that if it's not there, it returns a null. Something I cover in other videos, definitely an advanced topic, but for now, what you need to know is by replacing the original input, which is the body, with the filter body rather than the Parse JSON body, we'll now get a new array based on those 6 records from the filter and in this new structure with name and animal size. And of course, we can go on to use this new structure in the next action that I'm going to add, which is the create HTML action. So if we look for the create HTML action, which again is part of data operations, and it's looking for an array as input. If I go into the dynamic content, I can use the output from that select. And by using the output from the select is obviously built based on the filter array because we've used that as the input. And in terms of the fields that are returned, there are only 2 fields based on the common name and the size, but we've called them name and animal size by using the select to restructure or transform that data. So that's all there is to the create HTML table action. It needs an array as input. You can use a combination of these data operations to create your array so that it's filtered, so that it's restructured. You could alternatively use the advanced parameters here, go into columns, go into automatic, change it to custom, and do exactly the same as I did in select. Select allows you to do it prior to this operation, but equally you can do it directly in this create HTML action or in the create CSV table action too. I'll change that back to automatic, and whilst I've only got one more action to demonstrate, I'm going to surprise you with another use case of the select action. So we'll add in another select. I'm going to rename this to select animal names. And then in the from, I'm going to use the dynamic content, which is going to be the original output from our compose array. So our full array that we had, and it's open on the left-hand side right now. You'll notice in the map, we've got keys and values. I want to highlight this text mode. Now the advantage of the text mode is that you can create an array of strings. And in this case, I want to create an array of all of the common names, so this field here. Now, if I was to attempt to go into the dynamic content here and then look for the common name as part of the output of the original compose array, of course, I don't have that, it doesn't exist. I would need to make sure that I put the body of the Parse JSON. But because I haven't put the body of Parse JSON, if I was to try and use the body common name from Parse JSON, it would put my flow into an apply to each. I mentioned earlier that we can actually write our own expressions based on this structure here. So rather than using Parse JSON in this map, if I go into FX, I'm going to type in item, open close brackets. I'm going to use the question mark. I'm going to put in square brackets and single quotes. And I copied the common name with my Control C earlier. I'm going to paste that in with Control V, so they need to match. That has now given me the expression for the common name. And if we add that in, you can see it's saved, and that will give me an array of strings, and those strings will just be the common names like African golden cat, the Asiatic golden cat, the black-footed cat. That's all that array will contain, and that's all because I've managed to switch this select into text mode. Why is this useful? Incredibly useful if you want to get email addresses, because the final action that we can use is called join, and that allows us to join all of the values within an array based on a delimiter. And that delimiter, if we go into the join action and search for join, it requires an array as input. We're going to use the output from our select animal names, and we can join that with a semicolon. And just like you do with emails, when you're sending multiple emails to people, you want to send that email to everyone in the two, then you can separate them with semicolons like so. So if we start all the way back from the top, we have that original compose for the date, which is an expression that we've evaluated. That is a read-only variable. Then we have our compose array, which is pinned on the left-hand side throughout. That has an array of data, and we've used that array of data in our next action, which is the parse JSON. The parse JSON, of course, has been used with the sample payload to generate a schema, and by generating a schema, we can then access all of these key values dynamically. Into the filter array, we've used the parse JSON body, and we've checked to see if the size is equal to large, and that has reduced the size of our array from the 10 different animals to just those where the size is equal to large. In the CSV table, we've used the output from that original filter array, so it will create a CSV that has just those 6 animals where the size is equal to large. In the select, we've done some data transformation. We've created new key value pairs where we've got the name and the animal size using the dynamic content from the original parse JSON, but then we decided that we didn't want all of those records, we wanted just those from the filter array. So we removed the original from the parse JSON, and we swapped it out with the filter array, noting that these expressions are valid because they're written in a common way using item, open close brackets, square brackets, and then the name of the key. Moving on to the create HTML action, all I've done here is use the output from the select above where we've transformed that data. So this HTML table will just have 2 columns in it, and that'll be the column for the name and the column for the animal size. Then I've demonstrated another select where I've used the outputs from the original array, and then using the expression editor, I've added in an expression manually for the common name. So rather than having to rely on parse JSON, if you get more confident and you want to write expressions, you can avoid parse JSON entirely and just write out the expressions using this common framework of item for the current item, followed by the name of the field that you want to access, including the question mark where you want null to be returned if it's not found. If you exclude the question mark, your flow will fail, very much like the required field we saw in parse JSON earlier on. And then finally, because I wanted to demonstrate the capability of creating a string of these values within our select, I'm joining them using a semicolon, a feature that you might use if you're wanting to send emails to multiple people in the to property of the send email action. Now, how are we going to view all of these different outputs? Well, I'm going to test and of course run this flow, and we can quickly cast our eye over the data. But I think the other way to do it is probably to send myself an email. So I'll choose the send an email action v2. I'm going to unpin this compose array so we get the full space here. We'll go with my email. The subject can be test data. But to get things started, I'm going to say, hi, Damien. And then I'll say today is, and we can insert the dynamic content for the output of our original compose date. That'll give us the date. Here is your HTML table. And we can go into dynamic content and choose the output of the HTML table. And in fact, just as a reminder, the HTML table contains the 6 large cats based on the filter. We've also got the sample join. Here is the sample join based on the animal names. And again, into dynamic content, I'll choose the output of the join. And then if you remember, we had the CSV file as well. So if I go into the advanced properties, we have attachments. And in attachments, we can go and add a new item, and I can call that my sample file.csv. The content is going to be based on the output of our create CSV table. And if we add a little note here to say you will also have a CSV table attached with all records. And I hope that's right based on memory. So we'll publish and test this. So we can see that the flow is run correctly. We've got that original compose date with the date, the array that contains the array, funnily enough, parse JSON, which again contains the original array. If we have a look at the filter, if we look at the inputs over on the right hand side now, we have that original array of all the different animals with different sizes. But if I click on show raw outputs, we now have an array of just those 6 large cats. If we have a look at the CSV table, again, the inputs is based on the large data. So we've got those 6 large because it's based on the filter. If we have a look at the output, not very easy to see here, but it will be easier to see within our sample email. The select action, again, the input is based on the original data, that original array of filtered data with those large animals. If we have a look at the raw output, we have our new shape that has just the name and the animal size based on that filtered data. Looking at the create HTML, the raw input was just those 6 based on that new structure. The output, not so easy to see, but we'll see that in the email. It's an HTML table. If we have a look at the select, where we have all of that data as an input, remember I wanted to create an array of just the animal names, and I wrote an expression. If we look at the outputs, we can see that's exactly what we've got, all of those individual animals in an array. And then finally, if I jump to the bottom, we have our join, where the input has been that select of those animal names. We've joined with a semicolon, perfect for emails. If we have a look at the output, there we have it. All of those cats separated by semicolons. And of course, the final action being to send an email has sent as expected. So if I bring up that sample email on screen, we can see that today is the 1st of February. Here's my HTML table based on the 6 large cats because it was the filter. We have that new structure. Here is the sample join based on the animal names, which is the semicolon separated names. And we will also have a CSV table attached with all records. Well, I got that bit wrong. It's actually with the 6 records. I forgot. But if we look at the CSV, I click on it, it'll open. There it is, opening up in Excel because it's able to parse the CSV file. But we have all of those animals that are based on the large filter in that original structure. So there we go, data operations. We've covered all 7, lots to learn there. I'd love to hear in the comments things that you've learned from this lesson. And if you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again soon. Cheers.